You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Wish you could become a morning person? You know the type, up before the sun, early morning runs, first one to the office with donuts and a smile. How do they do it? Easy. With the new Galaxy Watch 8, sleep tracking and personalized insights from Samsung Health help you improve so you can wake up to a whole new you. One who, dare I say it, skips the snooze? It's possible. Train your sleep with Galaxy Watch 8. Learn more at Samsung.com. Requires compatible Samsung Galaxy phone, Samsung Health app, and Samsung account.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. This time, I'm joined by William Hiestand, the author of Kursk, 1943, Airpower in the Eastern Front's Most Pivotal Battle, which was published in August 2025. William, thank you for joining me here today, and thank you for agreeing to talk about your new book.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So, the Battle of Kursk, Operation Citadel, was the main German offensive effort on the Eastern Front in 1943. I think most people who are interested in the Second World War at almost any level have at the very least heard the name Kursk. But even those who know about the Battle of Kursk probably know very little about the actions in the air over the battlefield in 1943. So I think probably the best place to start our discussion here is with a little background information, right? So in the summer of 1943, what is the state of the Luftwaffe and the Soviet Air Force sort of in the air over the Eastern Front?
Excellent question. And the state of the air forces are the Luftwaffe always heavily outnumbered, except briefly after the start of the war when they devastated a lot of the Soviet Air Force on the ground, still had a big qualitative superiority when it engaged the Soviet Air Force. So they had better aircraft almost completely across the board. The Soviets later caught up in late 43, 44 in aircraft quality. And they just had superbly experienced and well-trained aircrew and pilots. So they were able to outmatch the Soviets, basically, especially during the summer months, whenever they engaged. But they were quantitatively very limited. So around the time of Kursk, about roughly 3,000 Luftwaffe aircraft in the East, combat aircraft. That's about what they started Barbarossa with. Air forces in World War II, by the way, they're losing aircraft all the time to accidents and maintenance problems and things like that. They get replacements, but sometimes you have to see what's the overall curve of the number in the force. So anyway, about 3,000, about what they had in 41. The Soviets started with 20,000, lost about 20,000 in the first 6 months of the war, real devastating losses, rebuilt. We're still losing at a very high rate, but they had moved their factories back to the Ural Mountains, and they were able to crank out aircraft that were, adequate and improving in quality in high numbers. So by the time of Kursk, about 8,000-ish Soviet combat aircraft at the front, spread pretty evenly with a concentration around Kursk because they knew about the coming Citadel offensive. And the Germans concentrating about 2 of their 3,000 aircraft, roughly, for Kursk itself. Just if you'd like to dive a little deeper, the Germans were still using the same bombers they'd started the war with, basically the HE-111, famous for the Battle of Britain, Ju-88, excellent, horizontal and dive bomber, the Ju-87 Stuka, very famous aircraft, symbol of the Blitzkrieg, famously too slow to compete and operate during the Battle of Britain, but in the East, where the Germans could provide better protection and they could keep the Soviets off their back, it still was a viable aircraft, and it could drop bombs very precisely when it dive bombed. Their ground attack aircraft, they were making efforts to improve that. And this is actually something that, ironically, in the Luftwaffe, although we always think of it as a ground attack force, and it was drawn increasingly to be a ground attack force in the East, had not been a top priority for the Luftwaffe at the start of the war. They wanted to support the army, that's very true, but they favored interdiction. So in 39 and 40, their way of operating was to attack the enemy air force on the ground, seize air superiority or as close as they could get to it, then start interdicting all the lines of communication to the front line, headquarters, ammo depots, trains, motor convoys, ground convoys, and do close air support when called upon for an important issue by the army, supporting the crossing at the Meuse at Sedan, be a classic example. In the East, much more just drawn into the grind of ground support. The army was always in desperate straits. It was always asking for Luftwaffe support. And so there's some famous modifications of aircraft that some of your listeners may be familiar with. The biggest one, which was always a model when I was a kid, was the Stuka modified to carry two 37 millimeter cannon, one under each wing, for improved anti-tank capability. And this HE-129 ground attack aircraft, which they put a 30 millimeter cannon on for Kursk. The fighter force, the German fighter force, was still technically superior to the Soviet fighters of the time. Bf-109, they had the G version, the Gustav, which had a more powerful engine. They kept upgrading the engine power as much as they could, pretty much maxed out with the G, as I understand it. And the FW-190 Focke-Wulf fighter was an excellent fighter and a very good fighter bomber. So in contrast to Soviets, PE-2, excellent dive bomber, sort of like the Ju-88. They were using A-20 Havocs, Lend-Lease aircraft from the U.S. Their fighters, again, were a little lower capability technically than the Germans. Had the LA-5, the Yak-1 and Yak-7B at the time. There were Lend-Lease fighters in the force, but not as many in Kursk. And then the most famous aircraft probably that, again, almost everybody's heard of is the IL-2 Stormovik, was heavily in evidence at Kursk. Heavily armored, can deliver rockets, bombs, had a cannon, machine guns, and they had the new PTAB, which is a shaped charged bomblet. They'd have pods with large numbers of these you could drop on the backs of tanks or trucks. Very effective. Just got those in time for Kursk. And the original model did not have a rear gunner, so it was very vulnerable to German fighters. And by Kursk, they had put out the model that had the rear gunner mounted to try to defend the aircraft against the Bf-109s. Just a note, night operations, the Soviets were ironically kind of dominant in night operations. And what they did is they used their old obsolete U-2 biplanes. I think they were called the P-2, PO-2 later in the war. And these were used for harassment missions. And famously, there were some women pilots, the Night Witches. I don't think there were any operating the Kursk salient at the time, but they're very famous for these night operations. So that's the aircraft. But then again, the huge advantage for the Luftwaffe is that they had pilots who had flown since the Civil War or the earliest days of World War II, super experienced, hundreds, sometimes even thousands of sorties in combat. And some of the fighter pilots in particular racked up these huge scores. The Germans really liked the ace concept. They also had U-boat aces and tank aces, but they celebrated their fighter aces very, very much. And they'd even kind of favor tactics that just sort of, loiter around at high levels, see if there's a good opportune moment, and have that high-scoring guy dive down, everybody else protect him, see if he can up his score more. Günter Rahl ended the war with 275 claimed kills. Hartmann was 352 kills. Those are the top. So some of these guys getting really into the dozens and dozens or even over 100 or more kills claimed during the conflict. And then Hans Ulrich Rudel, who was a Stuka pilot and wrote a book that was translated into English after the war, Stuka Pilot, I think it was called. And he was a flashy character and devout Nazi, post-war Nazi, never repentant. But he flew over 2,500 sorties. He claimed 519 Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front. And he also sunk a Soviet battleship in the Leningrad harbor in 1941. Was one of the guys who hit that. So again, super expertise. And their training was very robust, up to 300 hours training before you entered the combat force, a lot of it on the aircraft you fly in combat. In contrast, the Soviets had a very Soviet meet the quota attitude towards, we just need to pump pilots out of the training system, put them in the units. Stalin does not like understrength units. And so we're going to move these guys through as quickly as possible. They had very minimal training, sometimes arriving at their combat units with 20 hours whereas the German might have 300 hours. None of it in the aircraft they're going to fly in combat. And the training mostly focused just on being able to take off and land. So one of the slang terms for them was takeoff landing. So that's all they knew how to do. No training in aerial maneuvers, tactics, gunnery, anything like that. And actually, my research found out they actually even received very poor rations when they're in the pilot training program. So they actually arrived sometimes a little malnourished, and the squadrons had to, strengthen them up with food in addition to trying to do some remedial training. And so, at Kursk, there was a Sturmovik squadron. It flew out there. Only 2 of the pilots had ever had a combat mission before. The rest were totally new. And again, you have these German expert fighter pilots with, hundreds of hours in the air and many victories diving down on them. So that was their big edge.
When you mentioned the Stuka, one of the things that is really interesting to me kind of right now, or when this podcast or when this interview is going to be released, we're kind of finishing up the Battle of Britain episodes.
Yes.
And sort of the story of that with the Stuka, as you mentioned, is like this aircraft is old, slow, and too vulnerable to sort of be in the skies during the Battle of Britain. But then you look at sort of the Eastern Front up to Kursk, and like it is such a prominent aircraft in a lot of these air campaigns. Like you use it on the cover of your book. Like there's a picture of Stukas on the cover of your book. Like that's how important it is to these operations. So is it really a matter of sort of is it space and numbers? Is it the Germans being, like you mentioned, the Germans maybe being able to protect it better, or is it the Soviets kind of not having the capability or the pilots or the fighters to be able to attack it in the air?
I think a mix of both. Yeah, definitely the Germans were able to protect it better. And in most of the air campaigns I've studied, I've done a few of the Ospreys so far on the Russian front air campaign. And it seemed like the fighters would engage the fighters. The Soviets did have a defensive tactic of trying to protect their aircraft by engaging fighters. The Germans definitely dove down and engaged a lot of the Soviet fighters and Sturmoviks. So there were some Stukas knocked down. There were 8 Knights Cross holders who were experienced Stuka pilots who were lost during Kursk. That was considered a huge blow to the force. There are these extraordinarily experienced, Stuka pilots, often squadron commanders or whatever. But yeah, it was a mixture of Germans being able to cover them very well, Soviets having great difficulties engaging them and knocking them down. I would say Kursk was somewhat the swan song of the Stuka being very dominant during the day. After Kursk, the Germans tried to compete more strongly with the Soviets in night operations. They built up a night operations harassment force, and the Stukas gravitated towards being operated there. But Rudel, he flew a Stuka to the end of the war. So he favored the aircraft and was shot down several times. He lost his leg in 1945 and still flew after that. So,
and you mentioned that the Soviets were kind of dominant in night operations. Now, would you characterize that as the Soviets wanting to be dominant in night operations, or the Soviets being dominant in night operations as kind of default because they couldn't sort of do what they wanted to do during the day?
Absolutely default. So
okay.
In 1941, they lost so many of their first line aircraft, which tons of them were obsolescent aircraft from the 30s, the I-16 and the I-153, some biplanes. And really, they had built thousands of these U-2 biplanes as reconnaissance platforms in the 20s and 30s. They had thousands of them, and they're like, well, we can use them for night operations. And it was also, dropping stuff to partisans and other activities like that. They used them for courier operations and things. But yeah, they picked up this night harassment role where they'd basically fly around, try to find something to drop their small bomb loads on. And again, they become famous for the night witches. Another angle I could mention is the Soviets never had a strategic bombing force like the RAF or the US 8th Air Force in Britain, 4-engine, big loads trying to go in there and really smash German cities. They did have a force they called long-range aviation, and it was held at this time of the war as a separate command, totally under the control of the general staff. But it had IL-4 medium bombers predominantly at this point, had a very tiny number of PE-8 4-engine bombers, which was a diesel design the Soviets had, but they never made more than 100 of them, so it was a very tiny number. And these had suffered, or the long-range aviation had suffered such huge losses in the first months of the war. It only flew at night, with very few exceptions. So once again, they were defaulting to, well, we can fly at night and try to do some sort of bombing thing. And even though it's called long-range aviation, it bombed very close to the front. So it just would try to find some rail yards or something significant behind the front that would affect the battle that they would hit during the night. And the Germans, of course, were developing very sophisticated night fighters to defend the Reich against the British RAF night bombing offensive. Could not spare any for the Eastern Front, but right before Kursk, because of some effective long-range aviation raids, the commander of the 6th Luftflotte did get a small detachment of night fighters available to defend Orel and to knock down some of these LRA bombers, and they sort of backed off a little bit right before Kursk.
Yeah, but so at least, if they are forcing the Germans to respond in that way, that they're at least some level of effective in those bombing efforts.
No, the Germans laughed at these night raids initially, and then later they were like, "Hey, maybe we could do something like that."
Yeah, you can always tell if somebody's being effective in one of those things by forcing the enemy to respond in some way, and so can't laugh at them if you're having to defend against them later on. Hey guys, millions of men have problems with ED every year. Maybe that's you. Maybe you don't want to talk about it because nobody wants to talk about it, but it happens. And RexMD is here to help. RexMD is a licensed provider of ED medication, and it starts with just a short, simple quiz to help determine the best path forward for you. Everybody is different. There are no one-size-fits-all treatments, but RexMD has all of the options. Oh, and after some private consultations, your personal treatment arrives directly to your door in discreet packaging. You are not alone. RexMD has been chosen by 475,000 men. So if you need to be ready when the mood strikes, head on over to rexmd.com/SWW to get up to 95% off your ED treatment. See full details and usage at rexmd.com. Prescription required. Results may vary. Visit rexmd.com/SWW and get up to 95% off your ED treatment. Thank you, RexMD, for sponsoring this episode.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the Dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
Thinking about the story of the Battle of Kursk, sort of broadly, at least on the ground, I think on the German side, it's largely a story of failure. We don't have to get into all that on the ground in this episode or in this interview. That's a whole different story. But when I read your book, kind of about the air campaign, it seems like on the German side, in the air, they're doing pretty good, right? Like when we look at the performance of the Luftwaffe, they seem to be, I don't know if you could say accomplishing their goals, but they seem to certainly be contributing as much as possible to the ground campaign that is failing. So how do you evaluate the performance of the Luftwaffe during Kursk?
So, yeah, thank you very much for bringing that up. I went into my research, before I started reading the first books, with sort of a foggy, Kursk, big air clash, not really written about much, so it'd be great for me to dive into this, no pun intended. And I think I've read some claims that, the Soviets had some initial problems, but then kind of came back. And really what happened is, so very quickly, the Soviets, took these huge losses, as I can mention, throughout Kursk and other air operations. And they tended to be optimistic about reporting up heavy losses inflicted on the Luftwaffe. And of course, this made them look good. And, both sides always struggled with inflated claims of what their forces were doing. That happened throughout the war. But the Soviets tended to report up and treat a little more positively these huge loss rates. These were repeated in some post-war Soviet accounts and picked up in some Western accounts from the 50s, just because people did not have any information really available. The records can't get the Soviet records, of course. German records were lost, not very great. Anyway, so yeah, you'll read books which say, oh, they recovered, and by the end of the Battle of Kursk, the Soviets had air superiority. Well, this is absolutely not true. They took huge losses, about 900 aircraft in the first 6 days. Germans lost a little over 100 aircraft to that. So the Luftwaffe, it dominated. It shot down way more aircraft than it lost. And in addition, it did very effective close air support for the attacking ground forces. So the Germans had a system where they had Luftwaffe liaison officers attached at most levels of the ground forces commands. They'd done this since 1939. They were called FLIVOs was their acronym, which is kind of cute. I can't say the long German word, but it's air staff guy with ground guys. Anyway, definitely Army Corps, most divisions, many regiments. And then when you get down to the Panzer divisions, you could even have forward in armored cars, Luftwaffe with radios driving, sort of like the West did in West Europe in 1944, 45. So very good command and control, brought in waves and waves and waves of strikes to support the ground forces. There was weather. The Soviets did fight bravely back and disrupt many operations. The Soviets did get some strikes in on German forces, so it's not all one-sided, but it definitely was a terrific performance. And by July 12th, really, the Soviets on the northern part of the salient had pretty much just been battered into very little activity, the 16th Air Army, and were also pretty weakly operating on the south. The 2nd Air Army was down there. And so the Germans there had temporary, what we would call air superiority. I mean, they could fly where they wanted and they could keep bombing. But the ground forces, despite this support, just did not make the progress, especially in the north, where the Luftwaffe did very well. They never advanced much at all. Model's 9th Army, really only a couple of miles into the Soviet defenses before it bogged down. I think he called off his attack on the 10th of July. In the south, von Manstein was more optimistic, kept pushing forward. They almost broke through, they thought, on the 12th, ran into this massive Soviet counterattack, which led to the Battle of Pokrovka. And then they had culminated, as you'd say, although he still was optimistic and was telling Hitler we should continue the attack, but it petered out a couple of days later. And so really then in the analysis section, I tried to answer, why didn't the air success make more of a difference? And in addition, I think we can characterize this as the Luftwaffe's last major offensive success for sure in the East. I think it may be overall, but I'm hesitant to make that claim because somebody will probably think of something. But anyway, so really a turning point in that sense of they had been able to get the initiative, had successes in concentrated areas, and Kursk was about the last of that. After that, they were totally forced into a fire brigade role of taking their limited number of aircraft, flying from crisis point to crisis point and trying to help the Army and being gradually overwhelmed and pushed back, just like the Army.
One of the things you point out, I think, in your analysis section of the book is that we've kind of talked about some of the, I would call like the flashier or more obvious advantages that the Luftwaffe had. Their planes at this point were still qualitatively superior in a lot of instances. Mm-hmm. Their pilots had a lot of experience, which is so critical in air combat. But one of the things you mentioned is like the kind of the logistics and organization of the Luftwaffe were superior. Like you talk about numbers on like the sortie rate mm-hmm. of the Luftwaffe versus the Soviets. Like it's drastically different. Like it could not be more different. And that was a major kind of challenge for the Soviets throughout the battle. So could you dive into maybe why that was the case or what was happening there?
Yeah, it is a fascinating thing. The Luftwaffe, it was a very flexible, capable, adaptable organization. I don't mean to be a fan. I didn't start the research of these kinds of views. At Kursk, it had airfields much closer to the front, so they didn't have as far to fly to the action itself. They flew in a large number of planes right before the action, not to tip. The Soviets had strategic warning that Kursk was the target. That's very famous, through spies and things like that. But the Soviets weren't sure exactly what day, especially since Hitler kept delaying it to get more tanks to the front. Anyway, so, the Germans were able to wrong foot them by flying like 400 aircraft to the south, just, hours before the offensive started. Their, tactical level planning, really had that thing we always hear about the Germans, mission oriented, give the pilots a lot of initiative. of course, they're targeting hitting where they want to hit and covering it, but a lot of emphasis on the free hunting operations, especially by the expert fighter pilots. So you can go out there and hunt and knock down Soviet aircraft. In contrast, the Soviets really did here seem to have be hindered by the strict culture of lots of planning ahead of time in incredible detail, attempts to stick to those plans, and just being inflexible and vulnerable because of it. So, again, they had strategic warning of the offensive. They did these days of pre-planned strikes that they had mapped out, mission by mission. They had it all in their orders on the 5th of July, and it could not keep up with the dynamic nature of the battle. So these plans broke down very quickly. Also, there's an ironic point. The Luftwaffe was a completely separate organization. Göring owned everything that flew, he said. But they cooperated very closely with their army counterparts, all these liaison guys, these flevos, and they regarded themselves as there to help the army. The Soviets, the Air Army commander worked for the front commander, but they were nowhere near as well integrated. They did not have liaison guys with most of the lower headquarters. So they're sitting back there at their Air Army headquarters, kilometers back with their pre-planned thing, unable to get good information about what was going on in the front. And, often, again, meeting the demands of their command, the ground commander, we need help, just, flinging sorties willy-nilly into the battle. And at times, tactically, prescribing level altitudes for patrols and things like that the pilots were like, we're too vulnerable. We need to be much more flexible. Now, a lot of this changed, and actually the commander-in-chief of the Soviet Air Force, Novikov, did a study as the battle was going on. He sent teams out to find out what was going on. He came back with a lot of recommendations about we need to be much more flexible. We need to give more autonomy to lower units and things like that. So it was part of the learning curve. But they had learned a lot of the lessons similarly a few months before, fighting over the Kuban Peninsula in the south, which is just beyond the Kerch Strait, very famous today because of the war. Big air engagements down there in May and June, or April, May, and a lot of lessons learned there by the Soviets. And it did not seem like they were able to disseminate these. Again, tons of their guys were brand new to the combat and things like that. But so I don't know if that answers the question. But
one of the themes I've seen in all my podcasting is when military leaders know that their men are going into battle without enough training or without enough experience, is they try to create the crutch of extremely detailed planning. Like, you are going to go here and you're going to do this because I cannot trust you to use your judgment. And so it's interesting to see that maybe here happening with the Soviet Air Force.
I'd say another thing too is reading some of the stuff about the Russian front. The Russian culture was very much like, you've got to be trying. You've got to be sending your men or aircraft into combat, or you're going to be in trouble with the NKVD and Stalin and everybody else. And also, they reported these large Luftwaffe loss rates, but they don't seem to have hidden their own high loss rates. And in a way, in the Soviet system, this was like, this shows how much we're trying. And supposedly there was a reference to some front commander earlier in the war, and he was like, hey, the General Staff's noticed you're not taking many losses, so you're not really trying. It's very, very antithetical to the force protection and economy of force ideas we have. But
yeah, it's always interesting to see how the challenges of estimating an enemy's losses and let's call it generously, the overestimation of one's own effectiveness in an air campaign can really make it difficult, not just to understand the current strength of the enemy, but to understand how effective your own air force is being when it's combating the enemy.
Yeah, another idiosyncrasy, by the way, was the Luftwaffe, whatever reason, culturally, always tried to minimize their own losses. So there was they would report losses, and the quartermaster records were much better because they would say, hey, these, they said these 3 planes came back, but they're shot to pieces. They're basically, they crash landed. But anyway, so that was their cultural norm, was to underestimate their losses. Again, this makes the job of the post-war historian very complex with all these loss claims.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was interesting to hear earlier at some point you mentioned kind of how the the lack of sources in some ways has
Mhm.
impacted the views of the battle. And I'm always really interested to hear that kind of stuff, particularly around the Eastern Front. I've talked to several other historians over the previous months about this as well, where it's like the the lack of ability to get good sources on the Soviet side for better part of 4 decades has kind of really impacted how people view some of these events and have over the generations.
Yeah, of course, the first post-war years, it was all basically German officers' accounts were
Mhm.
extraordinarily dominant. Guderian, von Mellenthin, von Mainstein's book. And anyway, so yeah, it was only really in, I think, the 1980s, David Glantz started doing a lot of exploitation of Soviet sources and kind of brought that side of it. But the especially for the air campaigns, the stuff is very elusive.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, like, do we have good Soviet sources now for the air
No,
campaign? Or still a little rough?
no, the brief window of good access has kind of closed up, and
Yeah,
yeah,
I guess that's true as well.
yeah.
So, as with any
Mhm.
large Second World War battle, I think kind of the story of the battle and the understanding of the battle kind of gets confused over the years, right? And there ends up being, due to how we've heard accounts over the years, the sources that historians have had available, often there are myths built up around some of these larger events. Are there any myths around Kursk or the air campaign over Kursk that you encountered that maybe your thoughts on or your understanding of changed over the course of writing this book?
Sure. Yeah, there were a couple. One I have already mentioned, so I'll just briefly say it is the myth that the Soviets regained air superiority at the end of the battle. And this came from post war Soviet accounts that exaggerated their success. The other one, which you'll see quite a bit, still even in current books, is the claims that the Luftwaffe in certain engagements alone repulsed Soviet armored attacks. And these generally are the July 6th and July 8th attacks by this Soviet tank unit, 2nd Guards Tank Corps, attacked the flank of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps driving towards Pokrovka North. So 2 flank attacks. And the Luftwaffe did do a great job of mobilizing their ground attack forces. They had them all under one officer. He called them all in, mostly FW-190 fighter bombers with bombs to hit the infantry, and these HS-129 aircraft with a 20 and 30 millimeter cannon. And they engaged these Soviet tanks. And this again was like from post-war Luftwaffe officers, I think, writing for the U.S. Air Force, and they would say in both these engagements, for the first time in history, air power had repulsed a tank attack on its own. And modern research has just overturned this. The aircraft were very important, and they did knock out probably several tanks, but their SS troops were also present, a mile or so away, putting artillery and tank fire in on the Soviet forces. So uh, this is just but for some reason it sounds cool.
Yeah.
So it'll often be
Oh,
featured in accounts.
yeah. Thinking about how air power in the post-war period kind of evolved, like I bet air power advocates, especially in NATO, were all over those
Oh,
accounts
yeah.
of like, oh, look at what we can do. We need more funding. Look at what air power can do.
Amen. And the second one's very similar, and that is just again because the Sturmovik is so famous, IL-2s, you'll often get these claims of like, the Sturmovik's knocked out this many tanks. And these are variously sprinkled around, and generally research has shown that these claims are much too high. And at times, it's the classic, like, it's higher than the table of organization strength of the unit itself. So clearly, and just, my thoughts are the IL-2s, again, a lot of those pilots are brand new. They're not combat experienced. They're just issued these PTAB shaped charge bomblets that are dropped in canisters from low level. They're just issued these before the battle. And so it's highly unlikely they had that immediate dramatic impact. And there was one study, much later of a German convoy caught by air in 45, like, 30 plus vehicles knocked out. And they were able to study these. So they overran the area and studied them, and only one had been knocked out by air. So it just, again, there's some caution in these claims. They're obviously important. Obviously, it's very significant that a ground unit is being strafed or attacked from the air, and it has a big impact. And there's losses taken. But again, some of these lines will just be shot out, and so
Yeah.
a little mythical.
Yeah. And I always like to, I always mention, or I've mentioned several times on the podcast, like this isn't me like criticizing the pilots. Like it's
No.
hard to know what happened when you're traveling at however many hundreds of miles an hour over a battlefield. Like it's difficult to judge, and people are going to ask you how effective you thought you were. You see this everywhere, from these close air support missions to strategic bombing of Berlin by the 8th Air Force or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's they are being asked to evaluate something that's very difficult to evaluate, even if they had perfect information.
One tidbit I picked up was a lot of times an aircraft that's trying to evade attack will, surge its engine power, technical term for it, I'm sure, but dive, and it emits some smoke, and it looks like it's being shot down. And so the pilot will say, I shot down that aircraft, and really he escapes ultimately.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. Like how, because often when I see accounts of it, it is like, oh, like this pilot damaged the aircraft, so it started smoking, and then another one damaged it, so double counting or triple counting or whatever. But yeah, just like, juicing the engine as much as possible can make smoke sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's all I have today. Thank you so much for joining me here for the conversation, and thank you for writing a book on the air campaign over Kursk, which I had never read a book about until I read this one.
Thank you very much. Great conversation.